The study I'm going to be talking about today is titled Ungulates as Cartographers, using biologger and mapping data to build an energy landscape. This project is in collaboration with Swansea University, Grenoble University and the French National Office for Wildlife Hunting, or the ONCFS. Understanding animal energetics and movement is vital when you're looking to manage, predict, or protect a species. Applications include livestock welfare, allocating endangered species appropriate space or habitat, and the spread of disease or pests. A large part of warm-blooded species energetics is movement, making the understanding of what can influence the cost of transport key. These include wind speeds, thermals, slope lift, current speeds and water, superstrate composition and structure, such as walking through long versus short grass, substrate, for example sand or rock, and slope incline. This study will focus on terrestrial ungulate species, where we'll be investigating slope and habitat, with habitat dictating both superstrate and substrate. As slope incline, or angle, increases, so the cost of movement is expected to increase. Imagine walking uphill as opposed to level ground. Interestingly, the cost of moving downhill are also higher than walking on level due to the costs of braking. If the cost of transport for animals moving in different terrains can be quantified, it can help us understand the movement patterns and decisions by animals as a function of environmental factors. In fact, models can be built within the basic framework of an energy landscape in areas where animals move. An energy landscape details the energetic costs of movement of a particular species within a defined area. Knowing the cost of moving within an environment can help us identify energetically preferable habitats, movement corridors, and places that are energetically challenging. All things that can help us manage and protect the species better. The overall aim of this study was to use biologging data from 6 free-roaming ungulate species to build an energy landscape for each of them within mountainous region where they co-occur, and then identify and compare movement strategies for each species. This breaks down into the following 4 objectives. 1. To compare how slope affects the movement energetics of 6 ungulate species. 2. To model the cost of transport against the slope for various identified habitat types for each study species. 3. To combine the above with a basic framework that constructs species-specific energy landscapes for the animals moving up and down slopes. And finally, 4. To identify the paths within the area that should minimize movement costs and compare these to the paths taken by the study species to reveal the extent to which the species use more efficient pathways and examine how this relates to general species movement strategy. The biologger used in this study was called the Daily Diary, a system developed at Swansea University by Professor Rory Wilson and Dr. Mark Holton. The electronic device records acceleration in G, like G-force felt turning in a car or by a fighter pilot. Note that this is not true speed shown on a speedometer in a car, but the rate of change of speed. The acceleration is measured in 3 axes relative to the animal carrying the tag. Y, described as the up and down motion or the heave, X, which is the side-to-side acceleration or sway, and the Z, which is the back and forth acceleration or surge. These 3 acceleration channels are recorded at 20 data points in 1 second. The Daily Diary also records magnetic field intensity in 3 axes at 8 times per second for each channel. Other environmental variables recorded are pressure and temperature, both at 2 data points per second. The Daily Diary was enclosed in a housing within a battery and collected data alongside GPS, recording global position at a range of fixed frequencies depending on the species. This biologger setup was attached to a collar already deployed on the species, or was used as the lab-built collar construction and attached to the 6 species in a variety of ways. All the weights of the collars were within 3% of all the species' body mass. The table on the right outlines the different setups and logging periods used for each species. The figure on the left showing where the species were tagged in relation to France. All species were collared within the French Alps, but within massifs ranging in altitudes and habitat abundance. An important metric for this study is vectorial dynamic body acceleration, or VEDBA, To understand this value, we need to highlight a few points about how it is derived. VEDBA here represents dynamic acceleration, or acceleration produced by dynamism of the animal, with any gravitational component removed. In the process of its calculation, VEDBA uses all three acceleration axes, which are added vectorially. VEDBA values are always positive. As a result, the biologgers used in this study can provide a proxy for energy expenditure over scales of just a few seconds on free-ranging ungulates. As mentioned before, the GPS location frequencies were comparatively low temporal resolution. For example, one fix every 15 minutes or even one fix every 2 hours, and varied across species. So, to increase a location fix rate and bring all the species to the same frequency, a process called dead reckoning was used to fill the gaps between the GPS points. Dead reckoning uses vectors to construct routes by consideration of movement, heading, and speed over time. This process involved complex maths, which necessitated, among other things, considering pitch and roll offsets and normalizing magnetometer data. Overall, though, the tags allowed us to derive animal heading during movement, using VEDBA as a proxy for speed. In previous studies, VEDBA has found to have a strong linear relationship with true speed. But the relationship differs across species, so species-specific speed coefficients were needed. In essence, this is a multiplicator for VEDBA to derive true speed, which varies depending on species. This coefficient was derived by dead reckoning between GPS fixes and changing coefficients until the dead reckon path ran through the GPS locations. To ensure that we only investigated movement energetics when the animals adopted one movement mode, grazing and moving or walking behaviours were defined for each species. For this, we used simple thresholds and limits of VEDBA smoothed to effectively define these behaviours. Specifically, VEDBA was smoothed using a running mean over 20 data points, or every second. Note how the smooth VEDBA changes as the species changes behaviour, as shown by the figure below. For the accessible domestic species, these behaviours were ground truthed with observations. However, for the cryptic species, the behaviour rule was adapted from the domestic counterparts. The rule was adapted by taking the clear resting state and taking off the residual noise due to the collar. When using this approach to mark behaviours, our simple rule identified the peak of the step of walking. So, to be able to define continuous walking, we used a rule that specified if one step occurred within half a second of another, the walking was considered continuous. This approach thus gave us animal location and behaviour for every second. Now walking can be displayed across mapping data. For example, we have goats being mapped onto a slope using 25-meter resolution map and a shape outline showing the habitat types used in polygon shapes. Information can then be extrapolated from the mapping data whenever the species moved, and the corresponding metrics can be compared. For the first result, we're looking at how our energy expenditure metric, VEDBA, changes as slope incline increases. To produce this figure, the data used were condensed, as the raw consisted of over 4 million walking steps across 6 species. The slope value for each step was rounded to the closest integer. Then, the mean VEDBA smoothed value for moving steps associated with that slope percentage was plotted. The results show an unexpected trend for all species apart from chamois, where VEDBA smoothed is decreasing with slope angle. This result can be explained by ungulate species taking steeper slopes with more caution, so each step produces signals with less G. The overall negative trend meant this metric should not be used to build an energy landscape, but if the suggested explanation is true, then VEDBA per meters moved should reveal higher slopes as more costly. Average VEDBA per meter moved was plotted against a rounded slope and showed a positive relationship. Despite less energy required for each step on the steep slopes, more steps would need to be taken, adding to the activity metric, resulting in high VEDBA per meter, or high cost of transport value. To investigate how cost of transport changed during climbing up, climbing down, and walking on level terrain, each movement mode was defined. Pressure from the daily diary was converted to altitude, so altitude change could be calculated. To condense the raw walking step data, means of metrics and variables were calculated every time an individual travelled 10 meters. The data were used to define climbing up as a positive altitude change of more than half a metre, climbing down as a negative altitude change of more than half a metre, and level movement being classified as everything else in between. The box plots show how ascent and descent moving costs more energy than level travel. This trend is expected as apparent across all species, with ascent usually costing more than descent. A possible cause for this could be the ungulates taking advantage of their potential energy when being uphill. The same dataset was used to run simple linear models to show trends for each movement type within each habitat for every species. These models are displayed to show the number of models implemented. The key significant trends are mostly positive relationships between cost of transport and slope for most habitat types, with some exceptions found in wooded habitat types. The cause for this would need to be investigated further, as it is not feasible a habitat type would reverse this trend. The gradient of the linear plots changes depending on the habitat type, with predicted increase in coefficient values for bare rock when compared to grasses. This difference is due to the grass holding more soil and therefore offering more grit, making steeper slopes less costly to traverse. Here we have two energy landscapes mapped for domestic goats when climbing upwards. For the first, the average cost of transport for each habitat type was calculated, and then assigned to that habitat shape. The second uses basic linear model of slope against VEDBA per metre moved to predict the cost of transport for each slope value on the map. Goat walking behaviour for all 10 goats over a 27-day period was subset to one location per minute. Revisit analysis could be undertaken to then colour each data point, to give a heat map effect and try and reveal movement hotspots. These two maps show regular uses of grasses and bare rock due to their abundance, and extreme high slope percentages being avoided due to the energetic costs or the species' locomotion capacity. Models for each habitat shown before were used to produce an energy landscape that considered slope for each habitat type, almost a combination of the previous two figures. When no significant linear model was present, the average cost of that habitat was used, discounting the effect of slope. The energy landscape were repeated for ascent and descent for every species, giving 12 mapped models. Movement corridors could not be unveiled by just plotting the movement data, especially due to the many other factors affecting the cost and drive of moving. However, these maps could be run through further analysis to identify the species' movement strategies. To take into consideration the difference in slopes and habitat abundance, while also ensuring when an individual moves, the species' current location dictates the next one, a shortest possible trip and animal path were compared. 10 randomly selected hours during daylight were chosen for each individual. Assuming there was no movement barriers, the start and end point were interpolated. This was the shortest, most efficient route, if environmental factors were not affecting the cost of transport. Data points equal to the same number of moving steps for that hour were generated along the interpolated line. These generated locations along the quickest route were then compared to species data. The coefficients across the species could then be compared to identify which species moved more efficiently. This analysis is currently in process. The prediction is that amongst the domestic species, the heavier cow will move more efficiently when compared to the sheep and goat. For the wild ungulates, the ibex has a life history suggesting the species should move more conservatively when compared to the chamois and mouflon. When comparing the wild species to the domestic goats and sheep, with the livestock's movement being driven by farmers, this would in turn affect how efficiently the species can traverse their environment when compared to the wild free-roaming ungulates. In conclusion, the work so far has successfully used biologging data with behavioural definition analysis and dead reckon path construction to build an energy landscape for climbing up and down across 6 species. This study not only used this unique approach to map quantified cost of transport, but does this considering 2 environmental factors of slope and habitat. Thank you for listening. I'll take any questions now, but before the video finishes, I should give a special thanks to my supervisors, Professor Luca Borga, Professor Rory Wilson, and Dr. Rowan Brown. This data collection would not have been possible without Mark Holton and Phil Hopkins for all their help to develop the biologgers and collars. Additional thanks to the contacts in France, Dr. Anne Loyson, Dr. Matthew Gall, Dr. Pascal Machand, and Dr. Carol Toigo.